Okay, tonight's shiur, as usual, Ilui Mishpatim Mori Ben Dover Mer Ben Ruben Alevi Mirati Rachel Bat Harav Michael. And this week we have the privilege of reading parshat Mishpatim. And the parsha Mishpatim is one of those parshot that's very, very hard to give a summary of. It's relatively easy to categorize, but it's very, very challenging to give a summary of because there are so many different topics discussed in it. If I had to categorize it, again, most of the laws seem to be Mishpatim, which is civil law. And really the first, I would say, third to half of the parsha really discusses with that. But if we go through the parsha, we'll find that there are lots and lots of other topics in this week's parsha. And we are going to focus on one of those other topics. And I think if I don't know how to categorize this, but you'll see when we get into it, you'll see what my goal to try to get to tonight is. Okay. All right, everybody. Let's see here. Okay, whoever just joined, good evening. I don't know who that is, but welcome. I hope you can hear me. Okay, so the Parsha of Mishpatim, among the many topics it talks about, is I'm going to focus on two pasukim, which are almost the same exact pasuk. A lot of overlap in two different chapters, in two different contexts. So I've tried to reproduce them each in context. But the pasuk, as you can see that I've highlighted, is the pasuk that says, "V'ger lo toneh v'lo tilchatzenu." A stranger you should not oppress, and you should not. I'm not even sure what the word. Let's say you should not put him under stress, duress. Because you were strangers in Egypt. And that is chapter 22, verse 20. And then a little bit later in chapter 23, verse 9, we have a very, very similar pasuk that says, "V'ger lo tilchatz." The only difference between this and tilchatzenu is the one is in the plural, the other is in the singular. Again, you should not oppress the stranger. Now here it adds the phrase, "V'yatem yadatem et nefesh hager." You are aware of the soul of the stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now this phrase, "Kigerim heyitem be'eretz Mitzrayim," for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, appears in two other contexts, which I'm going to bring down right away, and then we're going to get back and start trying to discuss each of these. The first is in Vayikra in Parshat Kedoshim, where we are told the following: when a stranger shall live in your midst, in your land, lo tonu oto, you should again not oppress him, which is the same verse we had in our pasuk in Mishpatim. But then it adds a little bit more, ezrach mikem, like a citizen, like you, yiyelachem should be to you, hager agoritchem, the stranger who lives in your midst, v'ahavta lo kamocha, you should love him like yourself. Very, very similar to the pasuk of "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha." Higerim heyitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. There's that phrase again, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. But then this pasuk ends very interestingly with "Ani Hashem Elokechem," I am Hashem your God, which we know throughout Parshat Kedoshim always pertains, as Rashi tells us there in Kedoshim, pertains to mitzvot that it's not necessarily evident from the context. Unless you happen to be a mind reader, whether the person is meant well or meant to harm somebody. And that's why we have this Ani Hashem Elokechem in this context. And the fourth time we have this phrase is in Sefer Dvarim, where it tells us that Hashem is Osa Mishpat Yatal V'Almana. Hashem is the one who provides justice for the orphan and the widow. The Ohev Ger, and he loves the stranger, latet lo, to give him lechem v'simla, bread and clothing. And therefore, it continues, the ahavtem et hager, you are to love the stranger, higerim heyitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, I wanted, before we start going into this in detail, I wanted to contrast this or compare it with a very, very similar phrase, which again refers back to our existence or our time spent in Egypt, but it doesn't say ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, that you were strangers in the land of Egypt, but instead it says ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim. Okay, one says ki gerim hayitem, you were strangers. This one says, and this, by the way, that one appears 4 times in the Torah. Ki gerim hayitem Mitzrayim. The zacharta ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim appears 5 times in the Torah, all in Sefer Dvarim, that you have to remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and Hashem took you out from there. The first time we have that phrase is, interestingly enough, in the Aseret HaDibrot, but not in the Aseret HaDibrot in Yitro. Remember that we went through last week, we talked about the Aseret HaDibrot in Yitro. The reason given for keeping Shabbat is because Hashem created the heavens and the earth and rested on the 7th day. In Sefer Dvarim, when Moshe reiterates the Aseret HaDibrot to the generation that is going to inherit Eretz Yisrael 40 years later, he tells them that the reason that is listed in the Aseret HaDibrot for Shabbat is v'zacharta ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim. We have to remember that we were slaves in Egypt. Hashem took us out of Egypt, and that's why Al Kain Tzivcha Hashem Lokach Lasod et Yom HaShabbat. That's why we are commanded to remember the Shabbat day. Okay, we have, as I said, 4 other times besides this that this phrase v'zacharta ki eved hayita be'Mitzrayim or be'eretz Mitzrayim is going to appear. First is in a context that could be very, very closely connected to our parsha. We look at this context as ki macher lecha achicha ha'ivri o ha'ivriya, when your brother or sister will have to sell themselves to you, they should work for you for 6 years. Sounds very familiar to our opening chapter of Mishpatim, when you will purchase a Hebrew slave or Hebrew servant, which is the beginning of our parsha, very, very similar to this parsha in Devarim, which is looking at it from the perspective of the person being sold, rather than our parsha, which looks at it from the perspective of the person being bought or doing the buying. Excuse me. And then it tells us that when he works it for 6 years, in the 7th year he goes free, similar to our parsha. But here we have a specific command. When you do send that servant, that indentured servant, free after 6 years, lo tishalchenu rekam, don't send him empty-handed. Hanek tanik lo, you have to give him something to get him started in his return to normal life. You have to give him from your sheep, from your grain, and from your vineyards. From whatever Hashem has blessed you, titen lo, you have to give him. And interestingly enough, why do we have this additional mitzvah? Remember that you were slaves by and Hashem redeemed you. Okay, again, this person had to sell themselves, obviously had nobody to redeem him. That's why he had to sell himself into indentured servitude to provide for himself. So we have to remember that Hashem is the one who redeemed us. Therefore, we have to be nice to this person when we let them go. That's why Hashem commands us that today. And then we continue with a very interesting place to have a Zachar to Kev Mitzrayim. In the middle of the chapter that deals with the Shalosh Regalim in Parshat Re'eh, we have the following. We're told that Shiva Shavuot Tisparlach, we celebrate the Chag of Shavuot, but part of the celebration of the Chag of Shavuot is V'samachta Lifnei Hashem Elokecha. You have to rejoice before Hashem. You, your son, your daughter, your manservant, your female servant, the Levi who is in your gates. And who else do we have to make sure enjoys and rejoices? Bager, the stranger, Yatom Amana, the orphan, the widow, Hashem B'kirbach, or in your midst. Where does all this rejoicing take place? In Yerushalayim. But why? Remember, you were slaves in Egypt. Again, remember, this is in the middle of a discussion of the Shalosh Regalim, and it specifically says that we have to remember we were Avadim in Mitzrayim. Okay. The next time we're told this is in the context of Lo Tatem Mishpat Ger Yatom. Again, there we have the Ger connected to the the stranger connected to the orphan. The lo tachbol meged almana, you're not allowed to pervert the justice of a stranger or an orphan. You're not allowed to take away, illegally take away the garment of a widow. Again, what's the reason? Remember, you were slaves in Egypt. And again, Hashem redeemed you from there. Similarly, we have another set of mitzvot related again to the stranger, the widow, the orphan. When we collect our grains in the field and we leave one sheaf behind, we don't return to take it. We leave it for the stranger, the widow, the orphan. Similarly, when we harvest our olives, we don't take the peirim, the leftover olives on the edges of the tree. Similarly, when we collect our grapes, we don't take the olalot, again, the corner of the vine. Both of these are similar to the concept of peah in a field, that we leave a corner of the field. Again, who? For the stranger, the widow, the orphan. For all of those who don't have their own means, don't have their own field, we have to make sure we provide for them. And again, the reason, remember that you were an Eved in the land of Egypt. Okay, so as I said, we have two different ways the Torah tells us to do things. One of them seems to be related to one superset of mitzvot. The other seems to be related to a different set of mitzvot. And that's what I wanted to focus us on. But again, all of these focus us back on part of our national heritage. Part of our shared heritage is the experience in Egypt, which had two different stages. We were first Gerim, first we were strangers, and then ultimately we became Avadim, we became slaves. And each of those carries with it a certain memory. But it's interesting that the fact that we were slaves in Egypt only appears 40 years later. Moshe never had, there's never in the Torah that says, when Moshe is talking to the generation that left Egypt, because I don't think they needed to remember that their ancestors were slaves in Egypt, because they were the ones who were slaves in Egypt. It was part of their collective memory and each of their own personal memories. So I think just one of the reasons why we have here in our parshat, that you were strangers, because again, perhaps they didn't necessarily have that memory, because the stranger part being strangers, was their ancestors, their grandparents, the ones who originally came down to Egypt at the behest of Yosef and Paro as welcome guests, ultimately became strangers or were treated as strangers. So we have, as I said, two different aspects. One is in our parsha, primarily focusing us on not mistreating, not just the stranger, but the stranger in the context of the fact that they are a stranger, and others who might find themselves in positions where they look like, or they may feel like we, a person in position of authority or a position of power, might feel that they are weak and have nobody to stand up for them, and we will take advantage of them. That's really what this whole section of our parsha is talking about. Okay, if we look at the pasukim that immediately follow this pasuk ches of Ger lo tonev lo tilchatzenu, we find again same thing. Kol almana v'yatam lo ta'anun. We are also not allowed to afflict the widow and the orphan. And if we do, and they call out to Hashem, Hashem says, "I will hear their prayers." And guess what? You're going to be in trouble. Okay, so you don't want to get somebody who is in a downtrodden position into a state where they call out to God, because God promises to hear them, because they've been wronged by society. Now, it may be an individual within society, but society has there's nobody to stand up for them. Hashem says, "I will stand up for them." Interestingly enough, the pasuk, the second pasuk that I quoted from our parsha, is in a slightly different context. It's much more in a judicial context. If we look at the opening verses of that parsha, that section, it says, "Lo tatem mishpatim yon chabirivo." You are not allowed to pervert justice of the poor person in his dispute. Midvar sheker tirchak, avoid all falsehood. The nakivit tzadik al tarog, you're not allowed to kill someone who is innocent in judgment. Kilo atzdik Russia, I will not allow somebody to take somebody who is proper, who has harmed somebody who is attacked properly. I will not, somebody who harms him, I will not find not guilty. Similarly, v'shochad lo tikof, not allowed to take bribe, because the bribe will blind those who are wise and can turn around and pervert the words of the righteous. Even if you say, oh, I'll take a bribe, but I won't change the way I'm going to judge, it is impossible. It is humanly impossible for you not to be influenced by taking a bribe. The Gemara brings a very, very interesting case about that, where Rabbi Yishmael happened to have a debt that was due to him, and the person who paid it, the person he had leased his field to as a sharecropper, who paid him every Friday. He gave him his portion, whatever he owed him, every Friday. And one week he came Thursday to pay him. And he said, what's going on? Why are you here Thursday to pay me? That's not right. You don't come till Friday. And he said, well, I had to be in town anyway because I have a court case. So Rabbi Yishmael obviously said, okay, I'm obviously not going to sit in on his court case, but I'll sit and listen. And he sat, as he's sitting and listening, he no matter how hard he tried, he could not be impartial. Now, remember, this guy, it was just his own money he was paying him. He was just giving him what he owed him. But the fact that he had given him this money caused him to not be able to view the case impartially. Now, he wasn't sitting and judging it, but nonetheless, he realized how that he could not sit impartially and hear the case. So how much more so somebody who's taken a bribe that clearly does not belong to him. Okay. Now, in this context, it tells us V'ger lo tilchatz. Remember, this is a judicial context. We're talking about laws pertaining to the justice system here, and we're told that we're not allowed to oppress the stranger. Okay, now here the Torah adds because you who were strangers in Egypt know how it is to be a stranger. And I think the Torah here is teaching us a very, very powerful lesson about human relations. And that is the lesson of empathy, of being able to empathize with the plight of a situation that somebody is going through. Torah tells us, why will you be able to fulfill this? Because you know what it's like to be a stranger. Now, again, we think about being a stranger with a whole bunch of different people. Wait a minute, they weren't. I mean, what did it make? The Jews were all there. They shouldn't have felt that uncomfortable. But the fact is, when you're not on your own home turf, you are always feel different than the rest of society. Now, those of us who had the privilege or the misfortune or whatever you want to call it of growing up in Chutz La'aretz and then coming to live here, you can see the difference. You can see it not just when you look for it, you see it every day. It's very, very obvious that when you're living in a society where you are not of the main culture, it's very different. It's much more challenging. Whether it's December and you're worrying about the fact that, gee, it's nice and I don't have to worry about being inundated with, Santa Claus wherever I go, or inundated with those wonderful music that everybody either loves or hates when they go anywhere during December. I don't know how it is in South Africa, but I know that in the United States or Canada, but in the United States, when you went shopping during December, no matter where you went, there was this music in the background. There was, this festive air in the background. Now here it's the same thing, but it's a different festival. People are talking about eating sufganiyot and selling candles and making levivot, and you feel at home. And I'm sure that any non-Jew who is going here and that same period of time feels the difference too. Okay, and that's exactly what being a stranger is. And that's exactly why the Torah is according to one opinion in the Gemara, there are 36 times in the Torah we are told not to mistreat the ger. By the way, the second opinion of the Gemara says it's not 36, it's 46. I didn't do the count. I didn't want to go through it all. But clearly the Torah makes it a point that we are not to treat people like second-class citizens. That we, as a Jewish nation, have an obligation to remember our origins, to remember who we were, where we were, how we got here, and treat other people like we would like to be treated, no matter where they are, no matter who they come from. However, having said that, that doesn't take away from the fact that we have to be wary when we are dealing with foreigners who might have very, very different political agendas and may not be willing to abide by the law. That's a very, very different case. As you note here, this oppression of the stranger is clearly talking about a law-abiding citizen rather than a non-law-abiding citizen. So we have to understand that it's a very, very fine line between deciding, well, I have to be wary of somebody, but I can't mistreat them, versus, wait a minute, this person is not a lawful citizen, and I have to make sure that they can't harm me. So let's try to remember that as we're dealing with non-Jewish population here in Israel. That's a very big challenge, especially in light of the way newspapers like to sell themselves by proclaiming certain things, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. I want to go through some of what the parshanim have to say about what first and foremost is lo ton. What is the well? Firstly, if we look in the first pasuk, it says there's lo toneh, the lo tilchatzenu. What is the difference between these two? What do each of them mean? So let's now go to some of the parshanim and see what they have to say about all of these different concepts here. Okay. Rashi. Okay, Rashi tries to give us a very, very simple definition of these two terms. Lo toneh, and by the way, this is based on the Midrash, the Mechilta. It says, V'ger lo toneh. The word lo toneh is speaking about ona'ah, which comes, by the way, in two different forms we know from other places in Chumash. There is what is called ona'at divarim, basically means ridiculing somebody or making fun of them through words. The other is ona'at mamon, basically cheating them by overcharging them or underbidding on their product, underpaying them for what they're selling and overcharging them for what they are buying. Rashi says that here where it says V'ger lo toneh, that it's talking about onat divarim, it's talking about the first of those where I am embarrassing this person or belittling this person because they are a stranger. I am using my words to make them feel very uncomfortable, very not unwelcome in some way or shape. The lo tilchatzenu, however, the other verse, we should not oppress them, is gezelak mamon. He doesn't say mischarging them because that's a different pasuk. He says lo tilchatzenu here refers specifically saying, well, I'm a stranger, nobody's going to stand up for them, I can steal whatever I want from them. So in other words, it's going and stealing their things because they're a stranger and nobody's going to stand up for them. So in this context, the Torah is addressing the individual, every individual in that sense. Whereas in the second chapter where it says, we're not allowed to oppress them, there it's talking to the law enforcement community. In other words, the judicial system, the police system, the governmental systems that are set up to protect people from oppression. And that's a very different commandment in a different context. That's why both of them are here in this week's parsha of Mishpatim, because they both deal with how we deal with other people in a society. And that's why they're part and parcel of Parshat Mishpatim, but they're in two very different contexts. One is the context of the individual and how he relates to individual members of society. The other is the judicial, governmental, and how it relates to, specifically here, those who aren't the members of the majority in society. Okay, now Rashi adds a little bit, Kigerim Hayitem. Why does the Torah add Kigerim Hayitem, that we were strangers? Why should that have any impact? Why do I need that? Why do I need that? Why would that give me any more incentive not to oppress somebody who is a stranger, just remembering that I'm a stranger? And Rashi says a seemingly very strange comment. Imonito, if you will go and be not nice to this person, what? By presumably by saying, oh, see, you're a stranger, you're a nobody here. He can return, he can turn back and say, ha, so what? You too are descended from strangers who were strangers in the land that didn't belong to them. And therefore, a shortcoming that you yourself have, don't ascribe to somebody else. Another important lesson that Rashi wants to teach us from this pasuk, that we don't go around saying to people things that they can theoretically just spit right back at us, because they will, presumably. And in doing so, we are causing them to perhaps, get back at us. And that's not appropriate. We shouldn't be giving people the ammunition or the opportunity to be not nice to us any more than we should be being not nice to them. Now then Rashi gives a very, very interesting side comment here, just so we have an idea of what a ger is, a stranger is. Kol lashon ger. Wherever the Torah uses the lashon of ger, this language, it's Adam Shalo Nolad Biota Medina. It simply means a person who is not born in the country that he is dwelling currently. Elabami Medina Acheret Lagur Sham. He has come from a different place to live here. So in other words, in theory, ger simply means an immigrant in any shape or form, no matter whether they've been an immigrant for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. The fact that they are not a native-born citizen classifies them as a ger, as a stranger. Okay. Yeah. Okay. There's two different types of gerim. Okay. There is a ger toshav and a ger tzedek. Ger tzedek is the ger that we're familiar with. When we say a ger, somebody who is non-born Jewish who becomes Jewish, that's what we call a ger tzedek, a righteous individual, a ger tzedek, or a righteous convert. That's one type of ger. That's exactly what Rashi is telling us, that the word ger here in this context does not mean a ger, a person who's converted and become a Jew. That's not what this is talking about. This is talking about the second category, which is called the ger toshav, a non-Jew who has agreed to abide by the fact that this is a Jewish state, it's run by the Jewish government, and he accepts the 7 mitzvot b'nei Noach. He accepts that there are certain universal commandments that he accepts, i.e., there's no idolatry, and he accepts God, that we have to have justice, that the other universal mitzvahs, you don't murder, etc. So that is who this is directed primarily to. Ger Toshav, a person who is non-Jewish, who is living in Eretz Yisrael. They may very well, in theory, have been born here, okay, of non-Jewish parents who are living here under the same rule. Okay, but Rashi is saying that in general, when we have the word ger, we translate it as stranger, but it really doesn't mean stranger. It really means immigrant, somebody who's a non-native inhabitant of a country, which seems to imply, by the way, that a second generation ger toshav would no longer be considered a ger. But again, that doesn't mean you can go and mistreat him just because he's not Jewish, okay? That's not the intent here. But again, Rashi is trying to say that the primary focus here is on people who are non-native inhabitants of the land, who are just, and that's the general meaning of ger. As I said, I don't think Rashi specifically means it in here and to apply in this pasuk, but he's telling us how is it that we were strangers? Because we weren't born in Egypt. At least the first generation wasn't born in Egypt. Obviously, there were a lot of Jews, specifically all of the Jews that left Egypt, except for probably one or two, who all were born in Egypt. But nonetheless, the Torah, Rashi wants to understand that's the normal connotation of the word ger, a non-native person, a non-native born citizen. Okay, Rashbam also says lo tonu, as again quoting the same Mechilta, says very, very simply bidvarim, that when it means ona'ah means that do not treat him inappropriately through words. In other words, don't embarrass him, don't make fun of him, don't try to belittle him because he is a stranger. Okay, now why does it say? How do I know that it's not? Rashi didn't explain why he knew it was Onad Dvarim. He just quoted the Mechilta. Rashbam says no. Shari b'mamon ketiv lo tonu ish et achiv. That we already know that you're not allowed to oppress by mischarging and inappropriate financial dealings. We already have a pasuk that says lo tonu ish et achiv. Man should not mistreat his brother. V'adin l'chol Yisrael, and this is the rule for any Jew. Now, again, interestingly enough, by saying that it applies to any Jew, Rashbam is telling us that in our verse, we're talking about not a ger toshav, but a ger tzedek. In other words, a convert. Okay, that Rashi seemed to imply that we're talking about a ger toshav. Rashbam wants us to say, no, we're talking about a ger tzedek, a convert. You're not allowed to go to a convert and say, oh, how can you be Jewish? You used to eat non-kosher food. You used to do all this other terrible things. How and now you want to go be a Jew or you want to be somebody? So he can't be talking about money because we know that lo tonu, we already have a pasuk. You shouldn't mischarge a person, which refers to all Jews, whether they are native-born, natural-born Jews, or converts. So therefore, lo tonu in our pasuk has to be adding something. It's adding lo onad dvarim, not onad mamon. Elishtibar kasu behava v'hovesh yachol lehonot et hager b'mas avotav v'amasav b'geyut. Now, even though our mitzvah of lo tonu also applies to a Jew, just as it applies to a convert, but the reason the Torah picks the convert as the example is because it is more likely that people will ridicule somebody who is different than they are. No, somebody who was born a Jew would be more likely to ridicule somebody who decided to convert. Why? Again, to me, it's counterintuitive. I would think exactly the opposite. Somebody who chooses to be a Jew, I think they're much more praiseworthy than somebody who happened to be born a Jew and was stuck with it. They didn't have a whole lot of choice. I guess, although in today's society, I guess you do have a lot of choice. But again, being born Jewish, you say it's a much more stronger connection and much less reason to be praiseworthy to me than somebody who chooses to be Jewish when they could have chosen not to be Jewish. Okay, but again, Rashbam seems to imply that a person who is non-Jewish born is more likely a target of ridicule, and that's why the Torah picks him. Okay. Now, v'lo tilchatzenu, which Rashi translated up above as stealing from him, Rashbam doesn't go that far because we have a mitzvah for that. We already know lo tignov. We already have that lo tignov. We don't have not steal. But what does he say here? Lasot malachtecha. In other words, don't cause him to work for you without properly paying him. Vishu below goel, because he has nobody to redeem him. Now, why does he say that tilchatzenu, the word lachatz, refers to labor? In other words, don't misappropriate the labor of a convert. That's what Rashbam says this pasuk means. And how does he know that? Because I, Hashem, when the Jews are in Egypt, Hashem says, I have seen the oppression that the Egyptians are oppressing them. Kilomar, which is if to say, Mavidimotam, that they are enslaving them. In other words, it's not that the Egyptians were stealing money from them, they were stealing labor from them. Okay, they were utilizing them as a labor force. So what he's saying is lo tilchatzenu means that you appropriate this non-Jew or this Jewish convert as your laborer without appropriately paying him and without appropriately gaining his permission. In other words, you make him subservient to you illegally. That's what Rashbam says it's referring to. Kigerim hayitem k'moshe mefurish lefanenu, as this pasuk later on says, "Vatem yidatem b'nefesh hager kigerim hayitem fishtarato meruba," because the ger feels the pain more than perhaps a native-born Jew would feel. On shomerubo, the punishment for the one who is doing it is greater. So therefore, pasuk warns us to be extra careful when you're dealing with somebody who theoretically is more sensitive because of the fact that he's different than everybody else, that he's not one of everybody else. Okay. B'chor shor, v'ger lo toneh. you should not oppress, again, the stranger. Here's a very interesting perspective on why specifically the ger. I mean, this applies to everybody, but why is it specifically, the Torah specifically mentioned the stranger? He doesn't know the ins and outs of the culture of where he's living. So it's easy for him. Oh, he didn't know that he wasn't allowed to do this, or he was allowed to do that, or that there was a loophole here, or a quick shortcut here. He's not one of the people in the know yet. Therefore, it's easy. He's one of those, fire him. Don't have to worry. He's, take advantage of him. That's exactly what the Torah is telling you don't do. Why? Because you were strangers, therefore you should understand what being a stranger is, and you should bring him closer to you. You should want to take care of this stranger who is just like you. Once upon a time, we're a stranger and somebody took care of you or didn't take care of you, but Hashem took care of you and looked out for you. So therefore, you have to watch out for the stranger as Hashem's representative. His Kuni says, very interesting, again, same thing. He ends with the same thing. But he says here, this verse comes immediately after the pasuk that says, one who brings an offering to an idol will be destroyed. To tell you, why is that the verse? Why does the mistreating the stranger come right after a verse prohibiting idolatry? To tell us that just even though God abhors idolatry, nonetheless, when a convert leaves idolatry, whether it's a ger toshav who accepts only the 7 mitzvot, or it's a ger tzedek who accepts all of the Torah, in any case, he is leaving idolatry. God's saying when he leaves idolatry, I have great love for this stranger. Therefore, lo tilchatzenu lasot malachtecha. Do not oppress him. Again, as Rashbam said, do not oppress him by causing him to work for you, again, without appropriate A, compensation, and B, acceptance as appropriate. Again, and he close with the same thing. Since they're new, they just got here, they don't know the rules, they don't know all the loopholes, they don't know all the protections they have under the law. It's easy to mistreat them, as we see unfortunately, throughout many societies where people who are not savvy in terms of knowing the rules under which laborers or the laws of labor in that land, it's very easy to mislead them and mistreat them. That's why here's that's why the Torah specifically mentions them, even though, again, the mitzvah applies to everybody, not just the stranger. Okay, I'm going to skip Ramban because he's the longest, but hopefully we'll get back to him. We're going to go to Bereinu Chai for just 1 minute. Begelo Tonah, we should not oppress the stranger. Now, again, as we said, not dvarim, through words, but lo tochatzenim gzelat mamon, through money, quoting the same midrash that Rashi quotes. Okay, now b'kama mikomot katuv b'torah v'yisir kadosh baruch hu al hager lefi shager hu motza atzmo yechidi be'eretz nochriya. The reason that the Torah warns us so many times about mistreating the stranger is because the stranger is a person who's found themselves in a strange place. They're all alone in a land they're not comfortable with. It may be the language, it may be the culture, it may be all of the above and everything. The word ger comes from the lashon of gargir, a kernel, which is found alone. I'm sorry, a piece of a tree. Anaf ha'ilan, who's alone on a tree. Gargir is like a little piece. Therefore, since this stranger is all alone, people embarrass him, and they do evil to him. Therefore, Hashem tells us, Al tachshov she'ein lo mi sheyariv et rivo. Don't think that nobody's going to stand up for this person. Ki anihu harav et rivo. I, God, will stand up for him. And I will repay those that try to mistreat and harm those that are underprivileged in society, specifically the stranger. And therefore, it gives the reason, it says, you know the nefesh hager. It doesn't say you know hager, but ela nefesh hager. Kilomar yadatem ki kol ger nafsho shefala alav v'ein lo lemi yisa einav. He has no protection, plain and simple. He has nobody who's going to stand up for him. He doesn't know anybody in authority, anybody in position of power who will stand up for him and who will represent him and take his battle. He may lie, but he will turn to me, God says. The Alkain, and of course, once he does, Arachem alav, I will have mercy on him. Now, why is it you have to remember that you were strangers? Kemo sherichamti alechem kishiyitem geirim b'eretz Yisrael. Just like I, Hashem, had mercy on you and saw that the Egyptians were mistreating you in Egypt, so too I will remember that if you mistreat this person, and therefore, if you remember what you went through, you're more likely to have something that will keep you from mistreating the strangers. Interestingly enough, Bechaya continues with Tzarf, a love, and it attaches to him in the next pasuk, Ha'almana v'yatom. Again, the widow and the orphan. Lefisha kulan teshushe koach fabriot mikilim bahem. These are all people on the fringes of society who are not in the positions of strength in society, and therefore people take them lightly, lahara ulatzelem, to do evil and to oppress them. V'hinei dim'atam mitzuya, and behold, their cries, their tears are very, very often found. God says the gates of tears are never closed. God, you have to be very careful about them. Lehitiv, to do good to them. To treat them appropriately. Bein begufo, not only themselves individually, but bein b'mono, and also to take care of their money for them. Okay, as the Navi says, a number of places. And interestingly, he adds with the following: every orphan and every widow, even if the widow or the orphans are wealthy, and they have lots of love of the money. The widow is her tears are free flowing, because her soul is bitter because she's lost her breadwinner. Again, you have to understand, back then, women didn't have independent incomes, they didn't have independent means, and they were very much dependent on their breadwinner. So again, we have this whole concept of oppressing those who are in positions of downcast in society and have nobody stand up for them. Hashem says, I will stand up for them. And that's a very powerful rationale for things we should be doing automatically. But Hashem is saying, even if you really think you can get away with it, you can. And even if you want, there's no reason you would want to get away with it, but even if you think you can, don't. Okay, I'll just go this slightly different, interesting. Again, almost in line with what we read before about Avodah Zarah. Im kol kach mu'usi Avodah Zarah. You should not think that since Hashem hates Avodah Zarah so much, al Yashem amiganit misha avda gam achar shenit gayer. Therefore, you shouldn't think, since the person who worships idols is so despised by God, therefore it's okay for me to make fun of a person that they worshipped idols, even after they have left idolatry. Lomarlo, and I'll say to him, Etmol avodat avodah zarah, you're an idolater, so I don't have to worry about you. Therefore, the Torah puts these two juxtaposes these two psukim. He puts this immediately after Zoveach Elohim, bringing offerings to idols, so that we should understand that no matter how much Hashem hates idolatry, he very much loves the stranger, as we said before. Where do we see that from? When you were in Egypt. Now remember, it's not that just you were strangers. you also worshipped idols when you were in Egypt. V'shamnit gayartem, and there, by accepting the Korban Pesach, by bringing the Korban Pesach and accepting that you were getting rid of idolatry, you accepted God. Kasher lo mo'asva Hashem al shavat avodah zarah. Just like Hashem did not find you disgusting or didn't despise you because you worshipped idolatry. Milatet lach Torato, therefore the Torah very milatet lach Torato, and he still gave you his Torah. Gam lo yim'as beger hazeh. You should not feel disgusted by this stranger or this convert who's come and left idolatry. He kamohu kamocha, because you were in the same boat he's in. When he converts, he's starting a new life, and anything in his past is erased, just like you. All of your past was erased. Therefore, I'm warning you, do not bring up his past life of idolatry, because it's been completely erased and wiped out by his acceptance of Israel, of Hashem as his God. Therefore, similarly, don't remind the orphan, the widow, how good things were before, because again, they also feel that loss. That's why shesamach kol almana. So that's why the widow and the orphan are grouped together with the stranger for this very same reason. So I think there's a lot of very, very powerful lessons from this short section, which is, by the way, not by no means everything that's in parshat Mishpatim. There's lots of lessons here, lots of mitzvot here. But again, I think the lesson here from all of this, of remembering that we were strangers in Egypt and remembering that we were slaves in Egypt, and Hashem was the one who took us out, despite all of our shortcomings, despite of all of our failures, is the reason we have to always look for the positive of every interaction we have with other human beings, no matter how they are or who they are. Again, as long as they are law-abiding citizens and trying to improve and help build society rather than tear down and destroy society, we have an obligation to treat them appropriately and welcome them, just like we would like to be welcomed into a place where we are new and into a community where we are new. And we hope and realize that when we treat others that way, then perhaps they will respond and treat us that way too. And through that, we can help Hashem's word reach everybody, all of Jewish people, all of the non-Jewish world, and ultimately we will merit Mashiach. Thank you all. And I now open the floor up for questions, comments, feedback, and welcome those who joined a minute or two late. Can get a chance to say hello, but hope everything is okay. So welcome, and have a good evening. Have a good rest of the week. Anybody have any comments, questions before I close off for the night? Okay, Laila Tov. Have a good rest of the week, and we'll see you, Bez Hashem, next week. And wish you Chodesh Tov then. Laila Tov.